Stale resin coated the back of Conrad's throat, tasting bitterly of old pennies and damp canvas. Tonight wasn't a fight, it was a circus. 5,000 people crammed into a suffocating arena just to watch a 135-pound actor try to move a human mountain. It would end quickly. Peeling athletic tape off a roll sounds exactly like a heavy canvas sail ripping in a high wind. Conrad hated that sound. It was the soundtrack of his decline. He sat on a metal folding chair that groaned in metallic protest under his 420 pounds, systematically wrapping his massive toes. The locker room smelled of industrial bleach, stale perspiration, and the sharp, eye-watering sting of wintergreen oil. Arthur paced in front of the lockers. Arthur was a promoter, a man whose cheap metallic cologne always seemed to arrive in a room a full 3 seconds before he did. He checked his gold wristwatch for the 5th time in a minute. 30 minutes, Con, Arthur said, his voice carrying the nervous, high-pitched clip of a man who had borrowed too much money. You go out there, you stand in the center. You let him do the trapping hands routine. You brace for the shoulder strike. Make it look like a struggle. Then you take the step back. Give the crowd their moment. Conrad didn't look up. He pressed the thick white adhesive into his skin, feeling the coarse hair on his foot flatten against the tape. His right knee throbbed. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a deep mechanical ache, bone grinding on bone. He had spent 15 years across the Pacific, eating, sleeping, and bleeding in brutal training camps to turn his body into an immovable object. He had broken ribs, torn ligaments, and concussed himself more times than he could accurately count to master the art of leverage and mass. Now, he was 38 years old, his cartilage was shot, and he was taking a $500 payout in Long Beach to be a static prop for a television star. Pop, 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 pop. The sound drifted through the thin plywood walls from the adjacent locker room. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic, satisfying thud of a heavy bag being worked. It was a sharp, aggressive snapping sound, like a wet leather towel whipping against a cinder block. Conrad paused his taping. He tilted his massive head, listening. Pop, pop. Crack. It was Bruce. He was hitting the focus mitts. The sheer speed of the impacts was irritating. To Conrad, combat was about roots. It was about sinking your weight into the earth, establishing a foundation that a bulldozer couldn't uproot, and moving with the slow, inevitable force of a glacier. That rapid-fire snapping next door lacked gravity. It was noise. It was Hollywood. "Are you listening to me, Con?" Arthur asked, stopping his pacing to wipe a bead of condensation from his upper lip. "The television cameras are out there. This isn't one of your old underground pit matches. We need a spectacle. The little guy moves the giant. It's basic theater." "I hear you, Arthur," Conrad rumbled. His voice was a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to emanate from his broad chest rather than his throat. "I stand there. He pushes. I move." "Right, exactly." Arthur sighed, relaxing a fraction of an inch. "He's fast, Con. Don't let it spook you. Just hold your ground until the cue." Conrad finally looked up. His eyes were flat and hard, resembling 2 worn coins left out in the dirt. He wasn't spooked. He was humiliated. He looked down at his own hands, thick, calloused slabs of meat that had once tossed 200-pound men across clay rings as if they were empty laundry sacks. Now, those same hands were shaking slightly, not from adrenaline, from chronic fatigue. He resented the man in the next room. He resented the actor's pristine joints, his effortless speed, and the arrogant certainty that he could rewrite the laws of physics. Mass moves mass. That was the only truth Conrad knew. He leaned forward, shifting his weight onto his left leg to spare his right knee, and pushed himself up from the folding chair. The metal let out a loud clack as his weight left it. He tightened the heavy, thick grappling belt around his waist. The coarse fabric dug into his hips, leaving a familiar, abrasive friction burn against his skin. It was an uncomfortable sensation, but he welcomed it. It felt real. It was the only real thing in this entire manufactured building. "Let's get this over with," Conrad said, his breath hitching slightly as his spine settled into its compressed, painful alignment. Arthur smiled, a greasy, relieved expression. "That's the spirit, big guy. Easy money." Conrad walked toward the door. Each step was a calculated transfer of weight. His bare feet slapped heavily against the cracked linoleum. He didn't want easy money. He wanted his dignity back. But dignity didn't pay for the anti-inflammatory injections his knees required just to let him walk down a flight of stairs. As he pulled the locker room door open, the sharp pop, pop, pop from the next room abruptly stopped. Conrad paused in the doorframe. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. He ground his back teeth together, tasting the faint metallic tang of a bleeding gum line, and stepped out into the hallway. The concrete tunnel leading to the arena floor blew a current of hot, stale air directly into Conrad's face. It was a physical wall of heat generated by 5,000 bodies packed tightly into an inadequately ventilated auditorium. The noise hit him a second later. It wasn't the focused, intense hum of a traditional martial arts crowd. It was a chaotic, buzzing roar. Teenagers, karate hobbyists, off-duty dock workers, and Hollywood hangers-on, all shouting over one another. As Conrad walked down the tunnel, the smells washed over him in distinct layers. First came the sour stench of spilled beer warming on concrete. Then, the heavy, greasy scent of stale popcorn and cheap hot dogs. Finally, a thick cloud of cigarette smoke that hung like a toxic canopy just beneath the lighting rigs. He stepped out of the tunnel, and the harsh halogen lights blinded him for a fraction of a second. The heat under the lamps was oppressive. He walked toward the raised platform in the center of the room. Desmond, the referee, was already waiting. Desmond was a former boxer with a flattened nose and tired eyes, wearing a black and white striped shirt that clung uncomfortably to his sweating torso. Conrad reached the platform and placed a foot on it. It squished. He looked down. It wasn't packed earth. It wasn't tightly stretched canvas over solid wood. It was cheap, high-density foam covered by a thin layer of vinyl. It was a tumbling mat, a gymnast's playground. The disrespect settled deep in Conrad's gut, heavy and cold. He pulled his massive frame up onto the mat, feeling the foam compress pathetically under his 400 pounds. He couldn't root his feet properly. He couldn't dig his toes in. Then, the crowd's roar pitched up an octave, turning into a frantic, hysterical shrieking. Bruce walked out. Conrad watched him approach with a cynical detachment. The man wasn't physically imposing. He was wire and sinew, wrapped in a loose white top and dark, flexible trousers. But it was the way he moved that set Conrad's teeth on edge. Bruce didn't walk. He glided, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet in a restless, hyper-caffeinated rhythm. He wore thin-soled, flexible shoes that squeaked softly against the vinyl mat. Bruce hopped onto the platform without using his hands, instantly beginning to stretch. He pulled his arms across his chest, twisting his torso rapidly from side to side. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't even looking at Conrad. And he was chewing gum. Conrad stared at the rhythmic movement of Bruce's jaw. The sheer, casual arrogance of it hit Conrad right in the center of his chest. This wasn't a martial artist preparing for an exchange of energy. This was a man waiting for a bus. Desmond waved them both to the center of the vinyl mat. Conrad stepped forward, dragging his right foot slightly to ease the pressure on his meniscus. He stopped, widening his stance, letting his massive stomach rest over the knot of his thick belt. He looked down. He had nearly a foot of height on the man, and easily 250 pounds of raw, dense mass. Bruce stopped his frantic stretching and stepped up to the line. He looked up at Conrad. His eyes were entirely unreadable behind dark, slightly flared pupils. He popped his gum. "All right, gentlemen," Desmond shouted over the deafening roar of the crowd. He placed one hand on Conrad's massive, sweating forearm and the other on Bruce's lean shoulder. "This is a demonstration of force and redirection. Keep it clean. Keep it tight." Desmond stepped back, dropping his hands. "Bow to the center. Bow to each other." Bruce immediately snapped his feet together. His spine straightened perfectly, and he hinged at the waist in a crisp, deeply practiced bow. It was flawless, mechanical. Conrad didn't move. The instruction echoed in his head. Bow to each other. Conrad looked at the cheap, squishy vinyl beneath his feet. He looked at the harsh, glaring television lights tracking their every movement. He looked at the teenager in the front row holding a half-eaten hot dog, screaming obscenities. And then he looked at the man standing in front of him, chewing gum, waiting for a piece of theater to commence. A slow, hot spike of absolute defiance overrode the dull ache in Conrad's knees. He was tired of being a prop. He was tired of selling his legacy for folding cash. He had bled in the dirt for his title. He did not bow to actors on foam mats. Conrad locked his knees, wincing as the cartilage ground together. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, his biceps pressed against his pectorals, creating a wall of unyielding flesh. He stood perfectly upright, a stagnant mountain. He stared straight over Bruce's head, refusing to even acknowledge the boo. The silence in the room didn't happen all at once. It cascaded. The front rows realized what was happening first. The screaming faded into confused murmurs. The murmurs rippled backward through the folding chairs, infecting the bleachers, climbing all the way to the cheap seats in the rafters. Within 10 seconds, the boos began. Low at first, a rumbling vibration of disapproval, then rising into a hostile, localized thunderstorm of anger. They had paid to see their hero. They had not paid to see a stubborn, aging giant disrespect him. Desmond stepped forward, panic flashing in his tired eyes. "Hey," he hissed, waving a hand near Conrad's waist. "Conrad, bow. Cut the crap." Conrad remained perfectly still. The sweat rolling down his temple felt cold in the overheated room. Bruce slowly rose from his bow. He didn't look offended. He didn't puff out his chest or act to the crowd. The jaw stopped moving. He swallowed the gum. Bruce's eyes shifted, locking directly onto Conrad's chest. The kinetic, hyperactive energy instantly evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, static stillness. Bruce widened his stance by half an inch. His right heel dug into the cheap foam. Conrad felt a sudden, involuntary prickle of ice travel up his spine. The air between them seemed to compress, smelling faintly of ozone and hot dust. Bruce raised his right hand, loosely curled, resting it precisely 1 inch away from the thickest part of Conrad's torso. The crowd held its breath. 5,000 people went dead silent. The 30 seconds had begun. Dust motes hung suspended in the harsh halogen glare. 30 seconds is a lifetime when 5,000 people stop breathing. Conrad could hear the high-pitched electric whine of the television cameras panning across the mat. He could hear the squeak of Desmond's rubber soles shifting nervously in the periphery. Most vividly, he heard the shallow, rapid intakes of breath from the front rows, a collective gasp frozen in the back of 1,000 throats. Conrad dropped his center of gravity. He pressed his toes into the foam, searching desperately for the concrete subfloor beneath it, but found only yielding squish. The disrespect of the tumbling mat flared in his gut again. He tightened his core, drawing air deep into his belly, pushing his thick abdominal wall against his heavy leather grappling belt. 420 pounds of static resistance. He braced for a shove. That was the trick to these theatrical demonstrations. The striker pushes, extending the arm, using leg drive to physically displace the larger man. It was about moving mass through space. Conrad understood that physics. He knew how to anchor himself against a shove. He watched Bruce's eyes. There was no anger in them over the refused bow. There was no bruised ego. It was like looking into the unblinking lens of a camera, cold, focused, entirely analytical. Bruce wasn't looking at a man who had just insulted him on a public stage. He was looking at a structural engineering problem. Bruce's knuckles hovered exactly 1 inch from the thickest part of Conrad's sternum. The knuckles were heavily calloused, rough and yellowed, a stark, ugly contrast to the actor's otherwise pristine appearance and manicured presentation. Conrad held his breath, swelling his chest. Let him push. Let him try to move the mountain. Bruce didn't push. The movement, when it happened, was almost imperceptible to the naked eye. It didn't begin in the arm or the shoulder. It started in Bruce's rear ankle, a micro shift of weight, a sudden violent rotation of the right hip that snapped the shoulder forward with terrifying velocity. It wasn't a shove. It was an explosion contained entirely within a 3-inch spatial margin. The sound was horrific. It didn't sound like a fist hitting flesh. It sounded like a thick wooden baseball bat snapping cleanly in half over a cast iron fire hydrant. Crack. Conrad didn't feel pain, not at first. He felt a profound, deeply unnatural mechanical failure within his own chest cavity. The kinetic energy didn't disperse across his thick, protective pectoral muscles. The strike was too fast, too perfectly aligned. It bypassed the muscular armor entirely. The force drove straight through his sternum, sending a localized high-frequency shockwave rippling through his rib cage and directly into his vital organs. His diaphragm spasmed violently, seizing up like a blown engine block. Every cubic centimeter of oxygen in his lungs was forcibly expelled in a wet, ragged, involuntary cough. He didn't fly backward through the air like a movie stuntman rigged to a wire. Physics still applied to his mass, but his foundation was completely compromised. The sheer concussive force tipped his massive top-heavy frame backward off its axis. He was a felled oak. Conrad staggered. His ruined right knee buckled under the sudden, uncontrolled weight shift. He took one heavy, desperate step backward. His heel caught the edge of the squishy vinyl mat. He had no balance left to correct the error. Behind him, Arthur had placed a wooden folding chair, a prop meant to catch Conrad when he faked his stumble. Conrad didn't fake a stumble. He collapsed in a dead, uncoordinated plummet. His massive frame hit the wooden chair. It didn't just break. It detonated. Splinters of cheap pine and bent metal brackets exploded outward under the sheer, unmitigated force of 420 pounds landing dead weight. Conrad hit the floor. The impact rattled his jaw, clicking his teeth together fiercely. The back of his skull bounced once, hard against the polished concrete just beyond the mat's edge. Then he started choking. Panic does not roar. It suffocates. Conrad lay on his back in the ruin of the splintered pine chair, staring blindly up at the halogen stadium lights. They spun lazily in his vision, leaving trailing, burning streaks of bright white across his retinas. The brain demands oxygen. The lungs flatly refuse the command. He felt the cold, polished concrete pressing aggressively against his bare shoulder blades through the ruined wood. A piece of jagged metal bracket bit into his left tricep, slicing a thin line through the heavy muscle. He didn't care. He tried to draw breath. His chest remained completely rigid. The diaphragm was locked in a state of traumatic paralysis, acting like a heavy steel door slammed permanently shut inside his ribcage. His mouth opened wide, pulling in stale, hot air that simply pooled in his throat and went no further. A terrible, high-pitched wheezing sound squeaked past his lips. It sounded pathetically small for a man who cast a shadow like a city block. The silence in the arena held for exactly 2 seconds after his skull bounced against the floor. 2 seconds of 5,000 people processing a violation of physics. Then, the auditorium shattered. It wasn't a cheer. It was a chaotic, hysterical screech of mass disbelief. 5,000 people jumped to their feet simultaneously. Metal folding chairs scraped violently against concrete. Cheap plastic cups crunched underfoot. The noise didn't just enter Conrad's ears, it vibrated through the floorboards and directly into the base of his skull. It rolled over him like a physical tide, heavy, deafening, and utterly meaningless. Desmond was suddenly hovering over him. The referee's face had drained of all color, his tired, battered eyes wide with genuine panic. He grabbed Conrad's thick, sweating shoulder, his fingers digging desperately into the slick skin. "Breathe, Con." "Jesus Christ, breathe!" Desmond yelled. His voice was a muffled, distant echo, as if he were screaming through 6 inches of muddy water. Conrad couldn't answer. He couldn't even nod. He rolled onto his side. The movement forced a sharp, agonizing grind from his compressed spine. He pulled his massive knees toward his chest, fighting the stubborn stiffness in his damaged joints, curling into a massive, trembling ball. He squeezed his eyes shut and clamped his mouth closed to stop the useless gaping gasps. Nose. Breathe through the nose. He flared his nostrils, pulling a desperate thin stream of air inward. A tiny, agonizing sip of oxygen hit his lungs. It tasted like inhaled fiberglass. He coughed violently, his massive frame convulsing against the concrete, and spat a thick rope of bloody saliva onto the edge of the mat. Another breath followed, deeper this time. The paralysis was slowly, painfully breaking, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache radiating outward from his sternum. He pushed himself up onto all fours. The splintered remains of the chair dug sharply into his shins, scraping away layers of skin. He left streaks of heavy sweat and a smear of blood on the cheap vinyl. He ignored the sting. He looked toward the center of the mat. Bruce was standing exactly where he had been. He hadn't followed up. He hadn't stepped forward to flex his muscles, nor had he raised his hands to milk the screaming crowd. He had simply lowered his arm, settling back into a neutral, terribly relaxed stance. He wasn't even looking at Conrad. He was looking down at his own knuckles, inspecting them with mild curiosity, before casually wiping a bead of condensation from his brow with the back of his wrist. That was the knife in the gut. The absolute lack of gloating was worse than any taunt. If Bruce had celebrated, Conrad could have written him off as an arrogant punk, a flashy actor getting lucky. But to Bruce, this wasn't a triumph. It wasn't a clash of titans. Conrad wasn't a fallen gladiator. He was a successful math equation. Mass multiplied by acceleration. Data had been collected. The experiment was over. Conrad's 15 years of breaking his body in underground pits had been reduced to a baseline measurement for a television star's parlor trick. Conrad planted his massive hands flat on the floor. He ground his back teeth together, tasting the distinct metallic tang of a bitten tongue, and forced his right leg under his center of mass. The knee popped, a sickening, hollow mechanical clack entirely lost in the arena's deafening roar. He stood up. He swayed, profoundly dizzy, his vision tunneling at the edges. His chest throbbed with a dark, localized agony promising weeks of bruised, inflamed cartilage. Arthur appeared at the edge of the platform. The promoter was practically vibrating out of his cheap polyester suit, his face flushed dark red with adrenaline and unadulterated greed. "Beautiful," Arthur screamed over the noise, slapping the squishy mat with an open palm. "They ate it up, Con! Absolutely ate it up! Come on, let's get you backstage before the press mob gets here. We did it!" Conrad looked down at Arthur. He didn't speak. The gravelly rumble of his voice felt 1,000 miles away, buried under the crushing weight in his chest. He just stared at the greasy little man with eyes so flat, hollow, and terribly dead that Arthur's frantic, money-hungry smile began to slip. It faltered, freezing into a nervous, twitching unease. Arthur took a half-step back, his hands dropping to his sides, realizing suddenly that the 400-pound animal in front of him wasn't acting. Conrad turned his back on the promoter. He turned his back on the squishy, disrespectful mat. He turned his back on the referee, and he turned his back on the man in the white top. The walk down the concrete tunnel was a slow, excruciating march. Every heavy footfall sent a jagged jolt of shock up his shattered meniscus and directly into the bruised center of his chest. The hot, stale air in the tunnel felt incredibly thick, coating the inside of his recovering lungs like wet wool. Behind him, the chaotic roar of the crowd faded, swallowed by the dense concrete block walls, replaced by the high-pitched, relentless ringing in his ears and the heavy, wet slap, slap, slap of his bare feet against the cracked linoleum. He pushed his massive shoulder against the locker room door. It swung open on ungreased hinges. The sharp, sterile smell of industrial bleach and wintergreen oil welcomed him back. It was quiet here, brutally, oppressively quiet. He walked past the smear of chalk dust on the floor. He reached his corner and sat down heavily on the metal folding chair. It groaned sharply under his weight, the metal legs bowing outward slightly, but it held. It was the only thing tonight that had. Conrad leaned forward, resting his thick, hairy forearms on his expansive, aching knees. He stared at the dirty white floor tiles, tracing a crack in the linoleum with his tired eyes. His chest ached deeply, a constant rhythmic throbbing tied directly to his heartbeat. He reached down to his right foot. His thick, calloused fingers blindly found the edge of the athletic tape he had so carefully, painstakingly applied less than an hour ago. He pinched the edge of the white adhesive. He ripped it sharply off his skin, taking coarse hair and a layer of pride with it. The sound echoed loudly in the empty room. It sounded exactly like a heavy canvas sail tearing in a dead wind. He was a mountain. He knew that. He had spent his entire adult life eating, lifting, and bleeding to build himself into a fortress of dense muscle and unmovable mass. But sitting in the harsh, flickering, fluorescent light of the lonely locker room, a bitter, unavoidable realization settled into his gut like a swallowed stone. Mountains do not move, but they can definitely be broken. Thank you for reading this deep dive into the brutal realities of martial arts history. If Conrad's story moved you, please hit the like button and share this video with a friend who appreciates the raw, unglamorized side of combat sports. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our storytelling. What do you think? Was Bruce's strike just physics or something more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.